Welcome. I'm hoping that's hello and welcome in Dutch. Apologies if you are actually Dutch and know better. Anyway, this is City Breaks Amsterdam, episode 7, and I'm Marion Jones. This episode is dedicated to World War II and Anne Frank. And it's going to be an episode in two halves really, a more general first half about World War II in Amsterdam and how the population overall was affected, and then a second half devoted to the Jews and their history in Amsterdam during that most terrible, horrific of periods. If you're a City Breaks regular, you'll be expecting a little history and then a list of places to visit for each of those topics. And yes, that's exactly what the plan is. So, to set the context without going into too much detail, when World War II began in 1939, the Netherlands was hoping to remain neutral. But 10th of May 1940, they were invaded by the Germans, and on the 14th of May, Rotterdam was badly bombed. So that was the point at which they decided to surrender. This is what General Winkelmann said in his proclamation issued on that very same day, 14th of May. Quote, "This afternoon, Germany bombarded Rotterdam, while Utrecht has also been threatened with destruction. In order to spare the civil population and to prevent further bloodshed, I feel myself justified in ordering all troops concerned to suspend operations." And so for the next 5 years, Amsterdammers, in fact, the Dutch in general, lived under occupation. The Germans intended their country particularly to be a useful air base for their planes, especially with attacking the UK in mind, and a statistic tells us that about 3 planes a day, on average, were shot down over the Netherlands during the war. Liberation began to seem like a possibility after the Normandy landings in June 1944, but it wasn't until the 5th of May the following year, 1945, so a full 5 years after the occupying troops arrived, that the liberation of the Netherlands was complete. And this first half of the episode is about those 5 years, during which some 200,000 Dutch people, men, women and children, were killed because of the war, during which in fact the Netherlands had the highest per capita death rate of all the countries occupied by the Germans. And of those 200,000 and more people who were killed, over a half were Holocaust victims. The worst, hardest part of the whole 5 years was the winter 1944-5, known in Dutch as the Hunger Winter, when 30,000 people starved or died of exhaustion or cold and disease. How then did people react? The historian Lo de Jong writes this: "Most people, however anti-German their feelings, tried to protect themselves, their families and their property, adapting themselves to the increasingly difficult circumstances of daily life." So, as in other countries, France for example, most people's reaction was try and get through it, keep your head down, don't get into trouble. But there was a group at either end of that spectrum with a different attitude. The resistance, at one end, the people who felt duty-bound to try and do their best to resist what the Germans were doing to their country, and at the other end of the scale, the collaborators, people who chose perhaps, or maybe felt they were forced, into working alongside the occupying Germans. So the resistance, they did what? Lots and lots of things, producing forged ration cards, collecting intelligence and passing it to those still fighting the war. The British and the Americans, for example. They published underground newspapers. They sabotaged phone lines and railway lines to try and thwart the Germans' plans. They prepared maps. They hid Jews. They helped airmen who'd been shot down over their country to get back to their home country so they could continue fighting in the war. As a quick summary of those who collaborated, again, a whole range of things that people might have done. Some joined the German armed forces. Others were actively involved in capturing hidden Jews, perhaps even being paid for their work when they handed them over to the Germans. There were Dutch companies who supplied the Germans with the things that they needed to carry out their operations. So that by way of summary. The best place to learn so much more about all of this is the Dutch Resistance Museum, known as the Verzetsmuseum in Dutch. Here are the opening lines from their guidebook. Discover the Verzetsmuseum in the heart of Amsterdam and step back in time to the era of war, dictatorship, persecution and resistance. Here you will uncover the impressive history behind the difficult choices that the Dutch had to make during the dark days of the German occupation in the Second World War. I would highly recommend a visit to this museum if this is the topic that interests you. You'll learn a lot, even from a fairly brief visit. If you really want to take in everything that's there, I would suggest you need a couple of hours at least. And what you will find is a chronological walk, really, through the story, through all sorts of media, films, exhibits, photographs, documents. And the emphasis all the time is on personal stories, so actual people that they know about and the role that they played. Just on daily life in Amsterdam, for example, there's the story of Wim Dekker, a 19-year-old student who was asked to sign the Aryan Declaration, so a piece of paper saying, "No, I'm not Jewish," and who was horrified by this and worried what did this mean for his Jewish friends, but also worried what did it mean if he refused to sign. And he wrote about his dilemma and said that in the end he decided it was safest for him to sign. A few facts I gleaned from this aspect of the exhibition. 500,000 Dutch people worked in forced labour for the Germans during the war. Dutch women gave birth to 15,000 babies fathered by German soldiers. There was a truly haunting picture of a little 9-year-old girl, Settler Steinbach, on the train to Auschwitz. Why? Because she was from a Sinti family. And the caption underneath the photograph explains she was one of 245 people deported that day, of whom only 30 survived. The rest were murdered in the concentration camps. There's information too about the radio, which of course was under German control throughout the occupation period. But then there was Radio Orange too, which broadcast for 15 minutes a day from London, and which for the brave people who listened to it, when of course that was extremely risky if you were caught, helped to keep up morale and the hope that one day this would all come to an end. There's lots of information too about individual collaborators. I saw a map created by Dutch officials which showed the Germans where Jewish people were living. I read the story of one Wim Heinecke, who went under the title of Jew Hunter. He was paid by the Germans for every Jew he managed to find and deliver to them. And next to that there was a receipt for the day when he was paid 37.5 guilders for turning in 5 Jews. There was the story of a man called Anton van der Waals, who joined the German security service and then would go along to resistance groups, tell them that he knew they'd been rumbled, were about to be caught, and that he would escort them to safety. He would then take them and hand them over to the Germans. It's said that he turned over some 80 people, and after the war he was shot as a traitor. When liberation finally came, some 120,000 Dutch people were arrested for collaboration. There's lots of information too about individual resistance. The Drion brothers, for example, Huub and Jan, who ran an underground newspaper starting from October 1940, which encouraged all forms of passive resistance. They, I learnt, actually managed to survive the war, unlike another person running an underground newspaper, Ari Addix, whose house was raided by the Germans and who was shot dead on the spot. Then there was Piet Landwehr, who was the head of the Amsterdam Registry Office and who helped Jews gain new ID cards, so ones which didn't have the J for Jew stamped on them. Again, like all of these people, at enormous personal risk. There were the Jewish staff at the Hollandsche Schouwburg and the nursery over the road, the place where Jews were taken before they were transported to the camps, and the staff there managed to smuggle over the years several hundred Jewish children away to safety in the countryside. There was a pastor, one Henry Villings, who bravely announced from the pulpit, quote, "There's nothing more our soldiers can do. Now it's our turn. We will thwart the Germans wherever we can." It was extremely brave of him to speak out so publicly, but he was working below the surface as well. He, for example, found homes where Jewish children could be hidden and hopefully kept safe until after the war, but he was eventually arrested and died at Bergen-Belsen. Then there was Sjoerd Sjoerdsma, I may well not be pronouncing that very well, who was a secret agent, a link between the Dutch resistance and the Dutch government in London, who travelled the country with a transmitter, hugely dangerous if caught, so that he could send messages to London. Then there was a student, Eric, and a totally unpronounceable surname, which I'm not even going to try, who escaped to England and joined the RAF, one of 900 Dutch people to do so. He wrote a book about it afterwards called Soldier of Orange. Then there was Fernanda Kaptein, a bicycle courier for the resistance, collecting and delivering secret messages which would allow the underground operations to continue. She delivered illegal newspapers too. And there was a story of two little boys, Frans Nieuwenhuis, who was 11, and his brother, who were evacuated to Friesland during the hunger winter. 40,000 other children the same. Probably a move which enabled them to survive. But just imagine being their parents and making that decision. There is also in this same museum, of course, lots of information about the fate of the Jews during the period. Those who managed to flee, those who went into hiding, and the many, many more who were deported to the Nazi concentration camps. I learnt here, for example, that 70% of the Jews in the Netherlands at the start of the war did not survive. There were lots of details clarifying what happened when, in relation to the persecution of the Jews. May 1941, barred from professions so they could no longer practice, for example, as doctors or lawyers or chemists. August 1941, Jewish pupils expelled from the schools. September that year, banned from all sorts of other places, theatres, concerts, cafes, sports events, libraries. The list was endless. The following year, January 1942, unemployed Jews sent to the labour camps, and Jews more generally told that they should be packed and ready to move if ever ordered to. Also in 1942, in April that year, the order that they had to wear a yellow star from now on. And from June that year that there would be a curfew. They were not to be outside under any circumstances between 8 o'clock in the evening and 6 o'clock the next morning, and they were also banned from most forms of public transport. July 1942 was the date when the first train left Amsterdam for Auschwitz on what was euphemistically known as a work deployment. At the same time, the first raids took place, though German officers turning up at the house, arresting people, rounding them up. Here, just as one tiny example, a paragraph from Gert Mack's book Amsterdam, in which he's describing what a woman told him about what she found when she visited her Jewish parents in the city. Quote, "Mother told how she sat in the dark in front of the window every evening while people were dragged away like animals, shivering with apprehension because it could be her and father's turn at any moment. How large trucks brought in for the raids had waited there, loaded with people, whimpering or shouting out loud with fear, of whom only a hopeless tangle of arms and legs had been visible." And in addition to personal stories, statistics. For example, there were 80,000 Jews at the beginning of the war in Amsterdam, of whom only 5,000 were still alive after the liberation. And also, 98 deportation trains left Amsterdam for the camps, carrying more than 100,000 Jews. I've picked out 3 places in the city that you can visit to find out more about all of this. The first one is the ex-theatre, the Hollandsche Schouwburg, which is a memorial site close to the Dutch Resistance Museum, which has a wall of names as a memorial. So before the war, it was a lively theatre near the Jewish quarter, so lots of Jews in the audience. But the Germans took it over and used it as a sort of holding place, somewhere to take Jews that they'd rounded up and hold them until they took them to the central station and on to the camps. And just across the road was a creche where many Jewish children were held captive, and there were resistance workers there who managed over the course of the war to get about 600 children out and smuggle them to safety. This I found explained on their website. Quote, "The daycare centre was less tightly guarded than the Schouwburg. Even the door was left unguarded from time to time. This made it possible to smuggle children from the building. Babies and toddlers were carried out by the childminders in bags, boxes, suitcases, or even rubbish bins. The children were also smuggled out while going on group walks outside the centre." Just near to that is the Holocaust Museum, opened in 2024. Actually, its full title is the National Holocaust Museum, and there you will learn the story of all the different groups who were persecuted. So yes, of course the Jews, but also Roma families, Sinti families, gays. all told through some 2,500 objects and photographs and films and audio recordings. And thirdly, of course, Anne Frank's house, 263 Prinsengracht, which you will surely want to visit, and now's a good moment to say that you really must book that well in advance. If you leave it until you're actually in Amsterdam, you're quite likely to find that it's completely booked. So, a brief history of the building. It was a merchant's house built in the 17th century. It was used by Otto Frank, so Anne Frank's father, as business premises before the war. And in July 1942, when he decided that he and his wife and his 2 daughters, Anne and her sister Margot, would have to go into hiding, they chose an annex behind the warehouse for their hiding place, and they hid there for 25 months, not just the 4 of them, but also another family of 3, parents and a son, and a German Jewish dentist who'd fled to Amsterdam. The visit begins with a video room, and then into the former storeroom, where there are more exhibits telling the story of the war in general and of Jewish persecution in particular. After that, you will be going through the hidden door, disguised as a bookcase, which leads into the annex, and you can visit then the 2 floors, various rooms, where the 8 people lived in near silence for all that long time, just over 2 years. There were only 4 people who knew they were there and who kept them supplied with food and news from outside, until the date, the 4th of August 1944, when they were betrayed and the Germans arrived to arrest them, take them away and deport them to the camps. Of the 8 people who lived there, only one survived, and that was Otto Frank, Anne's father. When he eventually came back to Amsterdam after the war, one of the 4 people who'd been keeping them hidden, Miep Gies, told him that she had found Anne's diary and she gave it to him, and that's how, eventually, it came to be published. And here then to follow are a few extracts from her writing to give you the flavour, beginning with this opening quote. Writing in a diary is a really strange experience for something like me, not only because I've never written anything before, but also because it seems to me that later on, neither I nor anyone else will be interested in the musings of a 13-year-old schoolgirl. Oh well, it doesn't matter. I feel like writing. And thank God that she did, because I think of all the publications to anything to do with this dreadful story, that is the one that's had the most impact worldwide. Here then, from the beginning of the diary, is the point where her father tells her of the plan to go into hiding. Daddy began to talk of us going into hiding. I asked him why on earth he was beginning to talk of that already. And he said, you know that we've been taking food, clothes and furniture to other people for more than a year now. We don't want our belongings to be seized by the Germans, and we certainly don't want to fall into their clutches ourselves. So we shall disappear of our own accord and not wait until they come and fetch us. But Daddy, when would it be? He spoke so seriously that I grew very anxious. Don't you worry about it. We shall arrange everything. Make the most of your carefree young life while you can. That was all. May the fulfilment of these sombre words remain far distant yet. Anne's wish that it wouldn't be soon was not fulfilled, because here, from just a few days later, is her description of their getting ready to go. They had a distance of 2 or 3 miles to cover, and, of course, they weren't allowed to use public transport. They didn't want to be seen walking along with suitcases, because that would attract suspicion. So, here's her description of what they did. Quote, we put on heaps of clothes as if we were going to the North Pole, the sole reason being to take clothes with us. No Jew in our situation would have dreamt of going out with a suitcase full of clothing. I had on 2 vests, 3 pairs of knickers, a dress, on top of that a skirt, jacket, summer coat, 2 pairs of stockings, lace-up shoes, woolly cap, scarf, and still more. I was nearly stifled before we started, but no one inquired about that. You will keep finding that she does give these quite teenage asides, which give you glimpses into her personality. And here then is how Anne's entry from a few days later, the 11th of July 1942, begins. Dear Kitty. She started every entry like that, by the way, writing to an imaginary friend. So, Dear Kitty, Daddy, Mummy and Margot can't get used to the sound of the Westertoren clock, which tells us the time every quarter of an hour. I can. I loved it from the start, and especially in the night, is like a faithful friend. And in that same entry, here she is a little later, describing how she managed to decorate her room. Our little room looked very bare, at first with nothing on the walls, but thanks to Daddy, who had brought my film star collection and picture postcards on beforehand, and with the aid of a paste pot and brush, I have transformed the wall into one gigantic picture. And when you visit, you will be able to see a reproduction of that. A reminder, of course, that Anne went into hiding as a normal teenage girl. Most of the time, it was just the 8 of them in the building, visits from the helpers, and occasionally a little news from outside. On this particular day, a dreadful piece of news about people they knew, and one which was to affect them very personally. Quote, "The people from whom we obtained food coupons have been caught, so we just have our 5 ration cards, and no extra coupons, and no fats. As both Miep and Koophuis are ill, Ellie hasn't had time to do any shopping, so the atmosphere is dreary and dejected, and so is the food. From tomorrow we shall not have a scrap of fat, butter or margarine left. We can't have fried potatoes, to save bread, for breakfast any longer, so we have porridge instead, and as Mrs. Van Daan thinks we're starving, we've brought some full cream milk under the counter. Our supper today consists of a hash made from kale, which has been preserved in a barrel. It's incredible how kale can stink when it's a year old. The smell in the room is a mixture of bad plums, strong preservatives and rotten eggs. The mere thought of eating that muck makes me feel sick." And here, from April 1944, so not far short of 2 years after they first went into hiding, a description of a moment when they were all very frightened because there was a sound downstairs which made them wonder if they'd been betrayed. Somebody crept downstairs to see if they could hear anyone outside in the warehouse, and even though they weren't sure they could, they decided to sit in silence for hours well into the evening, in case somebody was there listening out for them. Anne describes how they sat in pitch darkness, communicating only in occasional whispers, until, quote, "It turned 10:30, 11, but not a sound. Daddy and Van Daan joined us in turns. Then, 11:15, a bustle and noise downstairs. Everyone's breath was audible, otherwise no one moved. Footsteps in the house, in the private office, the kitchen, then on our staircase. No one breathed audibly now. Footsteps on our staircase, then a rattling of the swinging bookcase. This moment is indescribable. Now we are lost, I said, and could see us all being taken away by the Gestapo that very night. Twice they rattled at the bookcase. Then there was nothing. The footsteps withdrew, and we were saved. So far. A shiver seemed to pass from one to another. I heard someone's teeth chattering. No one said a word." What is incredible about Anne's diary is that despite all this deprivation and fear, she had moments when she was really very positive. This one quote, for example, sums that up. "As long as this exists," she wrote, "this sunshine and this cloudless sky, and as long as I could enjoy it, how can I be sad?" You probably know that in the end the Franks were betrayed and arrested. We don't know to this day who betrayed them exactly, but there are eyewitness accounts from the moment of the arrest, one of which, quoted in a section at the back of the version of the diary which I read, reads as follows, quote, "There was no obvious drama about the arrest, no screeching brakes or banging with rifle butts. It was 10:30 on a sunny morning. The hiders had cleared breakfast and were resting in silence, as was their custom, once activity had begun in the warehouse. The helpers were at work in the front office. There were footsteps on the stairs, and a fat sergeant of the Gestapo, that the Dutch called the Green Police, pushed his head round the office door and said, 'Quiet, stay in your seats.' Several Dutch Nazis were with him. At gunpoint, Mr. Krahler was taken to the bookcase door. He said, 'But there's only a bookcase there.' At that point, he turned nasty, for he knew everything. He took hold of the bookcase and pulled at it. It yielded, and the secret door was exposed. I had to precede him up the steps. The policemen followed me. I could feel their pistols in my back. I was the first to enter the Franks' room. Mrs. Frank was standing at the table. I made a great effort and managed to say, 'Gestapo is here.'" That comes, by the way, from a book by E. Schnabel called The Footsteps of Anne Frank. Anne and the 7 other people in hiding were arrested, taken away, and sent to the camps. By the time the Netherlands was liberated, only Otto Frank was still alive. And here, as one last quote, is Anne and her thoughts on the future that she still hoped to have. It's difficult in times like these. Ideals, dreams and cherished hopes rise within us, only to be crushed by grim reality. It's a wonder I haven't abandoned all my ideals. They seem so absurd and impractical. Yet I cling to them because I still believe, in spite of everything, that people are truly good at heart. Of all the places in Amsterdam where you can learn more about the war, I do think it is a visit to Anne Frank's house that is the most unmissable of all. And just to finish off, mention of 1 or 2 other monuments in the city. I got hold of a booklet at the Resistance Museum, I think, called Persecution and Resistance in Amsterdam, which was a map, a walking route, which would take you about an hour and a half from Anne Frank's house to the Dutch Resistance Museum, past 35 monuments and other places which all have relevance to this story. So to name just a couple of them, something called the Homo Monument on Keizergracht, which is 3 pink triangles marking the fact that gays in the concentration camps had to wear a pink triangle. And it's a monument which commemorates the persecution of gays throughout history, including during the Nazi occupation of the Netherlands. Also listed is a place with an address that's almost unpronounceable, but I'll have a go. 178-80 Neuwezitz Voorburgwal, site of a soup kitchen, open every day during the hunger winter, where people could queue up for 1 bowl a day of what they called hunger gruel, so a thin soup made of, quote, meat waste, sugar beets and tulip bulbs. Much easier to find is the National Monument in Dam Square, where a remembrance service is held every May the 4th and a 2-minute silence. There's a monument on Vesperstraat called the Names Monument, designed in 2021 by Daniel Liebeskind, which has the names of over 100,000 Dutch victims from the Holocaust, none of whom have a known grave, commemorating then mainly Jewish victims, but also over 200 Roma and Sinti people. And lastly, on the Meierplein, something called the Dock Worker Statue, which commemorates a strike held in February 1941, which was the only mass protest held anywhere in Europe against the persecution of the Jews. Workers banded together and shut everything down. No trams, no trains, many factories shut, companies shut. And to finish the episode then, a quotation from that booklet which summarises the wartime situation in Amsterdam. Quote, in 1940, the residents of Amsterdam had to get used to marching soldiers, blackout rules and press censorship. From 1941 onwards, the atmosphere became even more grim. The city's large Jewish population was gradually excluded from public life and eventually deported to concentration camps. Nearly all of them were murdered there. Cars disappeared from the streets. Food and fuel became scarce. In 1944-5, the long, cold hunger winter followed. In a mass hunt for heating, trees were chopped down in the streets and windows and doors were ripped from the homes of deported Jews. I'm recording this in 2025, so 80 years after the liberation of Amsterdam, and the moment when eyewitness accounts and living testimonies from people who remember these days are becoming really very rare. But there's no doubt too that much information has been collected so that the story is not allowed to disappear. And in the city generally then, through all the places that I've mentioned, you can build up a picture of those 5 terrible years, 1940 to 1945. It's not a simple story to relate, but I hope I've achieved my 2 aims for this episode, which were really to outline some of the complexities involved and also to leave you clear about the places in the city where you can dig a little deeper and find out more. That's it for today then, and coming next, a change of tone, a change of topic, because I'm going to move on to art in Amsterdam. 2 episodes planned, in fact, one on the Rijksmuseum and one on Van Gogh and the Van Gogh Museum and some of the other places where you can see more modern art in the city. So all of that to come, but meanwhile, thank you very much for listening today. I know how to say that. Well, I know how to say thank you anyway in Dutch. Dank u wel. although I believe alternatives are available, for example, hartelijk dank, and I am told, although it still sounds rather unlikely to me, that the way to wish you goodbye in Dutch is tot ziens.